All right, so for those of you following in the Etz Chaim Chumash, we are on page 374, Parashat Bo. We are in the midst of the plagues. We've already had a number, and we're gonna see what happens next here. So, in the beginning of chapter 10, then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his courtiers, in order that I may display these signs among them, and that you may recount in the hearing of your sons and of your sons' sons how I made a mockery of the Egyptians, and how I displayed my signs among them, in order that you may know that I am the Lord." So what's going on here from the perspective of motivation? What's God's motivation? What's Moses' motivation? What's Pharaoh's motivation? Any thoughts about that? Well, I'll point out that Pharaoh seems to be a bit of a stooge in this moment. He's being played. His heart is being hardened so that God can display signs among the Egyptians. If a human were to do this, it would strike us as a little bit manipulative, that we are. Yeah, right?
You think a little? Yeah.
Maybe more than a little, actually. Yeah, thank you, David. If I'm going to set up a situation so that I can, beat someone up a little bit and show everyone what a tough guy I am, and it turns out that the guy was tricked into, standing up for himself or what have you, that would strike us as pretty antisocial behavior. It might be that you just have to read it a little differently when you're talking about God. I mean, that's sort of what ends up being the bottom line, is God, the creator of the universe, is the creator of the Egyptians, and kind of has the sole authority to do things like this that might, if it were anyone else, strike us as beyond the pale. That's perhaps a pious reading of the text. But regardless here, God's motivation doesn't seem to be primarily about rescuing the Israelites. This is a moment here where God sort of opens the curtain, and you get to see backstage, and you get to see that God is interested in much more than just this one generation of the Jewish people. God is interested in the story. God is interested in creating a compelling narrative so that you'll be able to teach it to your children and your children's children. I think the translation here is pointlessly gendered. I don't know why they stuck with sons and sons' sons. Because in Hebrew, the masculine plural works for both men and women. But clearly we are establishing here a really grand narrative, a really grand story. This is God as storyteller, trying to make sure that you have something worth remembering, you have something worth passing on. And so God is going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that these things happen, so that it makes for a good movie later. I mean, that's a bit of a cheeky read, but that's basically what's going on here. All right. It says, so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, that they may worship me. For if you refuse to let my people go, tomorrow I will bring locusts on your territory. They shall cover the surface of the land so that no one will be able to see the land. They shall devour the surviving remnant that was left to you after the hail. They shall eat away all your trees that grow in the field. Moreover, they shall fill your palaces and the houses of all your courtiers and all the Egyptians, something that neither your fathers nor fathers' fathers have seen from the day they appeared on earth to this day. With that, he turned and left Pharaoh's presence. So it's pretty straightforward what's going on here. The next plague is going to be a plague of locusts. And unlike some of the other plagues that feels supernatural, this one feels natural. I mean, the interesting moment isn't so much that locusts come, because locusts come from time to time. You can look in the news and you'll see every once in a while a big swarm of locusts has descended upon Egypt, and then maybe it's on its way to Israel. These things happen as part of the natural course of events. And so what's interesting here, what's notable is, first of all, that Moses is sort of predicting it ahead of time, making it clear that this is not a natural instance, but is in fact coming from God. And Moses also clarifies that this will be a much bigger swarm of locusts than has ever been seen in Egyptian history, and they will fill your palaces and the houses of all your courtiers and all the Egyptians. So this is going to be an enormous swarm of locusts, a swarm of locusts that perhaps moves beyond the natural category of things. All right, we'll keep going. So Pharaoh's courtiers said to him, "How long shall this one be a snare to us? Let the men go to worship the Lord their God. Are you not yet aware that Egypt is lost?" So that's pretty brutal. I mean, to say that to Pharaoh, to say that to the, in their conception of things, the incarnation of God in human form that was the king of Egypt. It's a really wild moment. You can imagine the drama of that moment, the way the palace intrigue has collapsed in on itself, and the folks surrounding Pharaoh are perhaps the last to notice that things have gone so terribly wrong. I always hate to make these sort of metaphors, but it does remind me of the movies of, the final days in Hitler's bunker, that sort of thing, where everyone's very interested in keeping up the pretense of keeping up the at this point, the lunatic ravings of the leader who has gone completely off the rails. And it's only at the very end that he finally actually gets some good counsel and actually sees here, only in the end, only at our doom are we able to speak honestly to you. Well, that's a bit of a problem from a leadership perspective. That might be why they ended up in such a bad situation in the first place. We talked about this in a previous week, that it's unclear, is this the same Pharaoh who ordered the babies thrown in the Nile? Is this the same Pharaoh who told the midwives to kill all of the boys? We don't know, but assuming it is, this is quite the moment here where, before he seemed very much in control. I mean, literally in control of life and death. And, is this people going to survive? Are we going to allow them to give birth to a next generation? And here you see in this moment that Pharaoh's sense of control is an illusion. It is, Pharaoh's control is what God allowed him to control. And things have utterly collapsed here. So the text goes on. So, please
Rabbi,
go ahead. Yeah.
I just thought, you spoke about the why the story is being laid out the way it is. Isn't this all about any leader who believes that they have taken the place of God, or kind of gradually coming to the realization that they are not God? And how, it seems that even so, monarchies going forward still kind of said they were in place because they had this special connection with God, or they are godly. this isn't the first or the last dynasty to proclaim that. And I don't know if any other religions have put a kind of a mockery to that or not. But is this a revolutionary? Is the way we look at it fairly revolutionary for its time, and is it still revolutionary? In terms of how it looks at monarchies and dynasties like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, a great point. And I think it is, honestly. I mean, I can't tell you that I have read all of the ancient literature of the time and I can make the most apt comparison. But I know people who have, and they agree that there is something fundamentally different about this text in its critique of monarchy, in its critique of power, and even going forward in the Torah, when you get to the legal sections, Moses as the lawgiver, the receiving of the Torah, it's spoken of in fundamentally different terms than you have in any other text of the time period. Other texts of the time period, you could imagine a story sort of along these lines. The culmination of the story would have been, we arrive in the land of Israel and Moses is crowned king. And then Moses as king gives us the law with the sort of divine hand guiding him to write the law. And in fact, that is expressly what the Code of Hammurabi says. The Hammurabi's code, the famous law code, begins with a declaration that I, Hammurabi, am king, and I have been appointed by Marduk, the king of the god of the Babylonians, and that Marduk has given me divine right to rule and divine wisdom. And so the law that I give you comes from the gods because I am the king. And it's a very different story to have the law come directly from God. And not only is Moses not crowned king, but there isn't going to be a king, and he isn't even allowed into the land of Israel. So it's a fundamentally different construction of power and the power dynamic. Yeah, David.
So Marduk gives divine right of kings to Hammurabi. And
right. So
there's a long line of divine right of king stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Deux Mont Blanc. But in the Egyptian pharaohs, one of the gods is Pharaoh. Pharaoh is, and it's not just this Pharaoh. I mean, it's all pharaohs. And so what is being disproven by the actual living God is that you can believe that a human being is God, but and you may really believe that. It isn't that God is giving Marduk, is giving Hammurabi, the insight or whatever. It is that you guys have gone along believing that this guy is God, a God, a God. I think the Romans did that too, didn't they? Have their gods, their emperors became gods at least at a certain point.
Yeah, by the end, by the second century, they were.
So it repeats itself, but I think this is I don't know how widespread it was that God is an individual. It was in Egypt, and so it was really, to me, I see it as a disproving of the norm that here's the greatest kingdom in which their ruler is a god, and the living God says no.
Yeah. I think you're right, and I think that's why in the previous parsha we see God say to Moses that you, Moses, will be a god or like a god to the Egyptians, which is a very confusing turn of phrase from a monotheistic point of view. But what the text is saying there is that Moses will assume the power that has been held by the God-man Pharaoh, and in fact, sort of assume that power for the purpose of dismantling the entire premise, the entire construction. The anti-monarchical tendency in the book of Exodus is very much there, and it's been a problem for kings going forward. I mentioned in a previous class, King James struggled with what to do with this. In his translation of the Bible, he didn't translate it, but he was in charge. He had the approval of what the committee was doing, and they were very concerned during that time. In large part because the Protestant Reformation it allowed people to question so many assumptions they had previously. One of those assumptions being the divine right of kings. But for generations, this has been a question. The rabbis writing the Talmud struggle with what to do with David, who is so clearly, God's beloved and also so clearly a flawed human being, a man with a lot of problems, a man who commits a vast number of sins. And the rabbis say, actually, no, he didn't, because technically Bathsheba had a get that her husband gave her in the event that he died in the war. I mean, it's this kind of they're reaching here, they're really reaching. Although it is notable, by the way, that the provisional get in case I don't come back from war has actually been kind of useful in the 20th century in Israel, because there have been some terrible cases of soldiers who go missing in action, and their wives are unable to move on with their life, get remarried because their death hasn't been confirmed. So halachically, that's a little bit useful, but in terms of the way the rabbis are attempting to reconstruct a story to fit their own vision of monarchy, it's strange, and it's notable that we get to see our leaders, we get to see whether it's the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Moses, or David. The Bible always has a pretty warts and all point of view of these folks, and later generations in their acts of piety might bring some midrash that says, actually it wasn't so bad. Abraham wasn't really using his wife to seduce Pharaoh. You're misinterpreting that. Reuben didn't actually sleep with the concubine of his father. These midrashim, I understand why they happen, but they sort of miss the point also, which is that these are critiques of power. These are critiques of human nature. And it's a very powerful text in the way that it presents you with these very complex views of human beings. I'll say one more thing on this subject before we move on, which is there's sort of the question we might ask, if we see this text as a critique of monarchy, is it in some way a critique of the Israelite monarchy? Was this written in a time and place where there were people who had some critical things to say about maybe the house of David or something like that? Or alternatively, was this text read in those times and sort of imagined to be applicable in those times? And it's worth noting that when Solomon dies and his son tries to take over, and 10 of the tribes say no thank you, and they form their own kingdom, and there's something of a civil war, although it doesn't really come to too much violence. It's a peaceful divorce between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. There is one person who is killed by the mob in this moment, and that is Solomon's taskmaster. Solomon had he implemented a corvée system where instead of taxes in the ancient world, people didn't have money so much. You had to give up so much of your grain when you were a farmer, and you had to give up so many days of your labor. So instead of paying so much to the IRS, you'd have to go work for the IRS. So for 100 days of the year, you didn't work on your own farm, you worked on the king's farm, or you built the palaces and fortresses and roads and this sort of thing. And Solomon had a very elaborate corvée system. He implemented a very high tax rate. And when it was time to settle accounts, only Solomon's chief taskmaster was the person killed by the mob. And the same word is used in the book of Samuel for taskmaster as is used here in Exodus for the Egyptian taskmasters. So there's clearly something going on there. All right, we'll keep going here. So, all right, so Pharaoh knows he's done. Pharaoh knows all is lost, or in this moment at any rate, he does. It says, so Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh, this is verse 8, and he said to them, go worship the Lord your God. Who are the ones to go? Moses replied, we will all go, young and old, we will go with our sons and daughters, our flocks and herds, for we must observe the Lord's festival. But he said to them, the Lord be with you, the same as I mean to let your children go with you. Clearly you were bent on mischief. No, you menfolk go and worship the Lord, since that is what you want. And they were expelled from Pharaoh's presence. So there's a lot going on in this little bit here. Up till now, Moses has been making a case to Pharaoh, let us go worship God. Let us go worship our God. There was, to use modern terminology, Egypt was behind an iron curtain. The people were not allowed to leave. The people were not allowed to emigrate. The Egyptians were concerned that if the children of Israel left, that they would ally with Egypt's enemies and come back in and take over the country. And so they just didn't want them to exist. They were frustrated with the reality that these people were there. They couldn't let them go. They didn't want them to stay either. And so they sort of enslaved them and attempted to reduce their population. But just leaving was considered to be not a workable option from the Egyptian perspective. Just kicking them out wouldn't have worked. And so when Moses is saying, let my people go, what he's saying to Pharaoh is, let us go for 3 days so that we can go into the desert, worship God, and come back. Now, that's obviously a lie. That's not what Moses has been sent to do. That's not the task that Moses has at hand. God, when speaking to Moses, is very clear that this is a permanent exodus. You are leaving. You are not coming back. We'll see in Deuteronomy, you're never supposed to go back to Egypt. It is still a mitzvah to this day. Don't go back to Egypt. Now, how we understand that in terms of our vacation plans, I will leave to another conversation. Plenty of Jews do wander into Egypt from time to time, look at the pyramids, go home. And there has been an Egyptian Jewish community for many generations, although they're certainly struggling in modern times. But we know that this is not a 3-day tour. This is not we're gonna hop over, we're gonna worship God, we're gonna come back. And yet Moses keeps saying that. And now Pharaoh has called him on the bluff. Pharaoh has called him out on the lie. Okay, you want to go worship God? You can go, but just the men. No women, no children, because in the ancient world, that was who would have worshipped on behalf of their families, on behalf of the sort of tribal units. It was religion was the domain of adult men, and this is speaking in generalizations. Obviously, I mean you have certainly plenty of female religious leadership and religious life. But you wouldn't have seen so much of it here necessarily. And Pharaoh is sort of letting giving them enough rope to hang themselves, letting them say to him, like, oh, this has all been a lie. Like this is not true. So there's a lot you can ask here. I mean, what is the gender dynamic? What can we learn about it? And also, what does it mean that we've got this duplicity here, that we have this lying and manipulation? Rebecca, I see your hand.
Yeah, my question was, did God give Moses the precise wording, or was the fudging the truth Moses's idea?
This seems to come from God. Yeah. This in an earlier parsha, we have that God kind of writes this word for word for Moses. So this there is some evident duplicity here from the top. And again, it's one of those moments where you would say, if someone else were doing this, you might question it. But when God is doing it, it makes you wonder what's going on. This is. Oh, please, David, go ahead.
So he's messing both sides. I mean, Moses' words, God's words through Moses are a lie, and he's hardening Pharaoh's heart to prevent him from responding to the words in any case. It's like but I mean, I didn't realize what your answer was to Rebecca. I kind of thought what Rebecca was suggesting was like Moses had, fudged. I didn't realize till you just explained that this is going on both sides. This is like a puppet show. The script's already there, not a puppet show, but an act, whatever scene.
Right. Yeah, it's puppet show is an interesting term. I don't know that I completely agree with with that, but it does really bring to light.
I retracted puppet show, but like a script. Yeah.
Sure. No. I think it's a useful way to construct it, even if we don't ultimately want to go quite that far. But it is along those lines, certainly. Yeah. And there's from my point of view, there's really only one way to read that sort of that sort of theater, which is that the generation that this is happening to is not the generation of ultimate concern. The ultimate concern lies with us, the people who read the story, the people who hear about it later, and we're going to see in a later parsha that this goes all the way to God saying, don't take the highway out of Egypt. There is a very established road going from Egypt to Canaan, and the Israelites could have gone on this very established road and they wouldn't have had any problem. It's about a 3-day walk and it wouldn't have been a big deal. But God says, no, you need to go into the wilderness. You need to go over toward that sea over there. It seems like a pretty bad direction to walk, so that the miracle can happen, so that the sea can be split. God has to set that up by encouraging people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, so that the miracle can happen, so that God can prove God's power, and so that it can, so that the story can be told. All right. So I want to say one more thing about this, which is that this is another moment where the text sort of has an implicit anti-monarchical point of view, and people for generations have been reading this and understanding God's message to be that one of the tools of power is that power claims a monopoly on truth. Power claims to know what is true, what is real, and they will tell you what is true and what is real. And they get to set the agenda. They write the histories. They will tell you, this land, here's the border, this country, they're the bad guys. I mean, the way the king and the way power has a monopoly on truth, it creates the world. It creates the world that you live in. And the only tool in the oppressed people's toolbox sometimes is to lie, is to dissemble, is to manipulate this so-called truth. And there is no sin in doing that. There is no harm that comes, there's no spiritual harm that comes from the oppressed using every single tool that they have to fight their oppressors, including lying to them, including saying things to them that are just straight up false. You might think it would be bad to lie, and it is bad to lie sometimes. You might think it would be extra bad to lie to the king, or to lie to the police, or to lie to the authorities. In a good cause, when it's all the oppressed have, then it comes from God. It comes from the highest sources. And by the way, this is a message that is still relevant to this day. It is a message that is not universally accepted. There are other groups of people who look at this book as a holy text, who say that because legal authority comes from God, it is against God's will to defy that legal authority, even in the case of oppression, even to your own doom or to your neighbor's doom. When they come to you and they say, turn over all the people who look like this, all the people who believe in that, you have a duty to follow the law, even when it is an immoral and unjust law. That has never been the way we looked at this text, and it's not the way that so many other people look at this text either. This is one of those moments where the book of Exodus, you see in it the seeds of the liberation of slaves in our own country, and the things people had to do for their own freedom, the way that they had to lie, had to manipulate, had to pretend everything was all right when secretly behind the scenes they were planning their escape. And it comes from the top. And the message is that sort of manipulation has the blessing of God. All right, so we're going to see what happens here. So Pharaoh is called our bluff, called Moses' bluff. And then in verse 12, then the Lord said to Moses, hold out your arm over the land of Egypt for the locusts, that they may come upon the land of Egypt and eat up all the grasses in the land, whatever the hail has left. So Moses held out his rod over the land of Egypt, and the Lord drove an east wind over the land all that day and all night. And when the morning came, the east wind had brought the locusts. Locusts invaded all the land of Egypt and settled within all the territory of Egypt in a thick mass. Never before had there been so many, nor will there ever be so many again. They hid all the land from view, and the land was darkened, and they ate up all the grasses of the field and all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left, so that nothing green was left of tree or grass or of the field in all the land of Egypt. So Pharaoh was right. Moses was lying to him, but he decided to call the bluff, but it turned out it wasn't a bluff. And the locusts did devour everything in the land. You can only imagine the agony of people looking at this and knowing what this means, knowing that their own doom has been sealed. They're not going to die today, but they are going to die. They are going to be hungry. There's nothing left in the country for themselves, for their children. It's terrible. It's a terrible, terrible image. And not the last time, by the way, we'll see locusts in the Bible. Locusts is a swarm of locusts is described as a judgment of God in a few different places, notably in the book of Joel. And it's also it is the only insect that is kosher to eat, precisely because when you're eating it, it's because there's nothing else left. There's nothing for you to eat. And so you can go ahead and eat these bugs that have eaten your crop.
Didn't they not specify which ones you could eat, though?
Well, the Torah doesn't specify a lot of things. The Torah makes it sort of unclear which birds you're allowed to eat. And the same with the locusts. And so we rely on Masorah, we rely on tradition, and communities that wandered far from the land of Israel lost the tradition. And so Ashkenazim don't know which locust you're supposed to eat. The Yemenites preserve the tradition, though. So the Yemenites, a Yemenite rabbi can tell you which locusts are okay to eat. And if you feel comfortable with that, you can go ahead and eat them.
I like the explanation too. I'd never thought of that. It's all that's left. I'd heard somebody else give a talk that at times the commandments are unclear, so you you put a wall around Torah by not eating any of them because you don't know which one was the one that you couldn't. But this makes a lot of sense because, on the other hand, if you're starving to death and you're going to die, aren't you allowed to eat treif as opposed to dying?
This is true. This is true. Yes, if you were in this position, you should probably go ahead and eat the locusts no matter what. And this is one of the verses. This is one of the bits from the Torah that sort of points us toward the concept of pikuach nefesh, even though it's less than completely explicit in the Torah. I have a colleague who was spending some time with the Samaritan community in the West Bank. And one Shabbat, one of them fell very gravely ill. And his Samaritan hosts hinted very strongly to him, it sure would be great if someone would call an ambulance because they do not believe in pikuach nefesh. But they knew that he did. And so they were happy to have him call the ambulance on a Shabbat. Yeah. What can you do, right? And he was happy to do it too. So it all worked out in that particular case. All right. So let's see. Moving on here, verse 16. So the locusts have devoured everything. It says, Pharaoh hurriedly summoned Moses and Aaron and said, I stand guilty before the Lord your God and before you. Forgive my offense just this once and plead with the Lord your God that he but remove this death from me. So he left Pharaoh's presence and pleaded with the Lord. The Lord caused a shift to the very strong west wind, which lifted the locusts and hurled them into the sea of reeds. Not a single locust remained in all the territory of Egypt. But the Lord stiffened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. It's a strange moment here. You're forced to wonder, what's the point? I mean, the locusts have eaten everything. Why bother to get rid of them? It's too late now. There's nothing, blowing the locusts away isn't going to bring your crops back. But it could be that what's going on here isn't logical, isn't rational. It's just about proving the power of God. It's just about a demonstration. And so Pharaoh's desire to get the locusts out of here might be from God, just like the hardening of the heart is from God. Alternatively, Pharaoh might just not be especially reasonable here. He wants the locusts to get out. He wants to be done with this. He's not thinking it through rationally. He's moved beyond rational category, and he just wants this over with. He wants them gone. So then the Lord said to Moses, hold out your arm toward the sky, that there may be darkness upon the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be touched. That's very powerful imagery. Moses held out his arm toward the sky, and thick darkness descended upon all the land of Egypt. For 3 days, people could not see one another, and for 3 days, no one could get up from where he was. But all the Israelites enjoyed light in their dwellings. Now, what this is a mystery. What does it mean to put darkness on the land? We can understand locusts. We can even understand a river of blood. I mean, these are tangible things. Darkness is not tangible. Darkness is the absence of light. And what would it mean to put darkness on a country? It's a bit of a mystery. Was it a heavy cloud, a sandstorm, something like that? Or is this not naturalistic? Is there no way to explain this according to the laws of physics? Is this a return to primordial darkness? Is this God briefly interrupting the creation story to say, okay, well, I gave you light on the first day, and now for some of you, I'm taking the light away. And that's simply how you're supposed to read it. It is a disruption of the natural order. It certainly feels unnatural. It certainly feels not like a sandstorm or something like that. A darkness that can be touched, a darkness that such that people couldn't even see each other for 3 days. No mention here of, what if you turned on a lamp or something like that. It just seems like the world is covered in darkness, or this part of the world is completely covered in darkness.
It almost, to me, I mean, this is like way figurative, but it sounds like clinical depression, like part that nobody could, leave their homes. They couldn't connect with other people. I mean, I know this is figurative. It's not what's in the writing, but it just sounds different. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I love that. And certainly the timing would make sense. They've lost their food. The starvation appears to be imminent, and now they find themselves covered in a spiritual, metaphysical darkness. I think that's very apt. Thank you. That's really beautiful. This is why I love Torah study. I really do. I have not encountered that idea, but it's so beautiful. Thank you.
Like we all bring our professional or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to see. It's interesting, by the way, to note that there was no warning about the darkness. That might be another piece of evidence for Rebecca's hypothesis here, that Moses doesn't go warn Pharaoh, you keep this up, we're going to put some darkness on the land of Egypt. It's just the locusts blow away, and then the darkness comes. And it could be that we're just sort of tired of the formula at this point. You can just assume that Moses went and spoke to Pharaoh and warned him, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and all the things that keep happen this time, and you don't need to be told about it.
Verse 20, Pharaoh's heart does stiffen in between the two.
Right. Yes. Pharaoh's heart stiffens, but there's no warning. I'm going to bring a plague of darkness. It's just God says, okay, hold out your arm, and then the darkness is going to come. So it could be that the darkness is in some way an extension of the previous plague of the locusts. That it could be that the darkness is like Rebecca says, it is a spiritual darkness. It is a psychological depression that comes when things seem doomed, when things seem lost. This is all of a piece with what Pharaoh's courtiers were saying before. Don't you know that Egypt is lost? And Pharaoh seems to be the last one to know, as is so often the case. But everyone else knows. Whatever happens, maybe we keep these slaves, probably we don't. But regardless, our country has been utterly ruined. Our country has been destroyed. So Pharaoh then summoned Moses and said, "Go and worship the Lord. Only your flocks and your herds shall be left behind. Even your children may go with you." So now Pharaoh's still negotiating. He's not in a strong position, but he still thinks he can negotiate these things. And he says, "I'm giving you everything you want, except I need a little insurance policy. I need you got to drop something off at the pawn shop, and it's going to be your flocks. I need your animals to stay here, but you can all go, but I need to hold something to make sure you're coming back." But Moses said, "You yourself must provide us with sacrifices and burnt offerings to offer up to the Lord our God. Our own livestock too shall go with us. Not a hoof shall remain behind, for we must select from it for the worship of the Lord our God. And we shall know with what we are to worship the Lord. And we shall not know what we are to worship the Lord until we arrive there." So Moses, you might note here, is still lying. He's still telling Pharaoh that we're leaving for 3 days to worship. And we need our livestock to go with us because we need to select the livestock that we're told to select for sacrifice once we arrive. Now, you might think at this point the game is up. I mean, it's very clear that whatever's going to happen is going to happen. It's the will of God. The God of Israel is much, much stronger than whatever powers or potentates you find in Egypt, human or divine. And Moses can say whatever he wants here. Moses can give up the pretense, put away the facade, but he still insists on convincing Pharaoh to let him go for only 3 days. And it's interesting to ask why. Why is that still happening here? There are a couple perspectives that come to my mind. One is that Moses, just like Pharaoh, isn't entirely aware of the shift in power dynamic. Moses is still relying on old habits and still assuming that he needs to get permission from Pharaoh to go into the desert so that he can hatch and escape afterwards. You know, at this point, no one knows what's going to happen next except for God. And Moses might be assuming that they're going to go out in the desert and then they're going to have to flee the Egyptian army that follows them. So hard to say. That could be happening. It could be that Moses here is trying to give Pharaoh an out. That this is a way you can negotiate with someone who's used to being in charge. A way you can negotiate with someone who thinks he's superior to you is you don't say, here's everything I want, and I'm going to leave. It's here's everything I want, and I need it to go do this thing for 3 days. And we both know what that actually means. But I'm going to give on principle here. I'm going to sacrifice the principle in negotiation, my freedom. I'm not asking you to give me my freedom. I'm asking you to give me a 3-day break because I know you can't give on principle, but you can give on practicality. And this is actually many people point to this idea as a way that really successful leaders and really successful people negotiate. Always give on principle. Always give on the things that don't actually matter. Don't ask someone to give up their own identity, their own principles, their own sense of who they are. The king of Egypt doesn't want to stop being king of Egypt, and he's not going to give the slaves their freedom. He's not going to be an ancient Abraham Lincoln. That's not who he is. He is willing at times to be a good master of his slaves. And so by presenting him an out, by giving him an option where he can say, I'm just being a good master, you're likelier to get what you want in the end by surrendering on the principle and just asking for the practical.
I like that from my field. The Middle East, among other places, the issue of face saving and all is very important. When Abraham, I've given a talk at the synagogue on this about the negotiation for the grave at Machpelah. I mean, there's all this talk that's, you know, everybody understands what's underneath it, but it's the what's being said and what's actually being done don't match, but we all know why they don't match. So I really like that explanation. I did have one practical question. I wondered about this with the army too. Aren't all the animals starving too? Where are the animals? He says, you know, Pharaoh must give them too, and also the chariots come racing afterwards. Where are all the animals that the Egyptians still have coming from after all this?
That's a fabulous question. Yeah, that is a wonderful question. There's a midrashic answer that essentially, so until you have the splitting of the sea, until the people, the children of Israel, walk through the sea and sing Shirat Hayam on the other side. Shirat Hayam is sort of, it's like the seal that makes you an Israelite. That is what makes you. You have left Egypt. You are now part of Am Yisrael. You walk through the sea and you sang Shirat Hayam. It is compared to the birth canal. It is compared to the first cry of an infant. And everything before then, the categories are a little fluid. Am I an Israelite? Am I an Egyptian? Am I something in between? And so the idea is that the horses that the Egyptian army got after the plague had killed all the animals, the horses that they used to chase us, they bought from us. They bought from some group of people who were sort of halfway in the middle. They had one foot in each camp, and they were Israelite enough to avoid the plagues, but then they didn't want to miss an opportunity for a deal. And so when the Egyptians came to buy some new horses, they said, yeah, sure thing. So some of those people end up coming with us. And the Midrash goes on to say they're the ones who led us to the sin of the golden calf and that sort of thing. But yeah, up till then, these the categories are a little wobbly. And as I mentioned on Friday night, there is a Midrash that says that of the biological children of Jacob, only 1/5 of them left Egypt. 4/5 stayed behind. 4/5 didn't make the leap. Didn't walk across the dry sea. And those people stuck around, and presumably they sort of blended in and became Egyptian. And it's only this righteous remnant that makes the decision, makes the commitment to keep going and to become the Jewish people. All right, we're going to have to wrap it up here. Thank you all for coming. This is a fantastic conversation. I love these conversations. And we're going to get this up on YouTube, put it up on the Facebook group, and you can let people know about it if you think they would have enjoyed this conversation. And you can send them the link. And I want to thank you all for coming and wish you Shavua Tov, a good week.